Breeding plantations were an especially horrific aspect of the institution of slavery in the United States. They were essentially farms where enslaved people were forced to have children in order to supply the slave trade with a steady stream of new laborers. The concept of breeding plantations is a highly controversial topic in the history of American slavery, largely because the term is not used in most historical documents, which can make it difficult to assess their prevalence and operation. And although there are varying interpretations among historians and scholars on the existence or prevalence of breeding plantations, there is substantial evidence in the historical records that enslaved people were coerced, often violently, into producing children. And while the term breeding plantation implies a type of plantation dedicated specifically to this practice, it's more accurate to say that forced breeding was a widespread practice across many types of plantations and other sites where enslaved people were held. Enslaved men and women were often encouraged or coerced into having children because their children would also be enslaved, thus increasing the property holdings of the slaveholder. This was especially true after the United States banned the international slave trade in 1808, which increased the demand for domestically born enslaved people. Many enslaved women were subject to systematic sexual exploitation, including rape, and their children became property of the slaveholder. This cruel practice not only served the economic interest of the slaveholders, but also became a tool of psychological control and oppression. It was used to dehumanize enslaved people, reducing them to the status of livestock in the eyes of the slaveholders. It makes you wonder why the Me Too movement never mentions any of this sexual violence against women, as that whole concept is not new to America, because American slavery did in fact start in 1619. Now, it's important to note that the term breeding plantation itself is somewhat contentious among historians. Some scholars feel that it creates a misleading impression of industrial-scale breeding operations, when in reality, the practice of forced breeding was more widespread and diffuse. However, there's no denying that the forced reproduction of enslaved people was a widespread and deeply inhumane practice throughout the history of American slavery. Or maybe historians, many of them white, either refuse to admit the inhumane cruelties of slavery in America, and or they try to minimize the seriousness of the issue of forced breeding, or of the very issue of slavery itself. What do you think? The trauma of this forced breeding has had lasting impacts on the descendants of enslaved people. It is a part of the historical legacy of racism and inequality that continues to affect the United States today, over 400 years since slavery of kidnapped Africans began in America in 1619. It's a difficult and painful part of American history, but one that is important to understand in order to fully recognize the horrors of slavery and its long-term effects. So why can't that be done? What is America afraid of? Or what is white America afraid of admitting? Perhaps at just how cruel or evil some of its own ancestors were? Slave breeding refers to the systematic attempt to influence and control the reproduction of enslaved people, usually for the economic benefit of the slaveholder. During the antebellum years, numerous escaped slaves wrote about their experiences in books called slave narratives, which often recounted the interference of slave owners in the sexual lives of their slaves, usually the women. There were instances of rape, arranged marriages, forced matings, sexual violation by masters, their sons or overseers, and other forms of abuse, often causing psychological trauma and breaking family bonds. This could also include forced incest, as slaves were sometimes given hoods or bags over their heads to keep them from knowing who they were forced to have sex with, which could have included possibly their own family members. This was all part of an effort to produce more enslaved individuals who could be sold. So why is the term matings used? That was just another way of handling of the slaves to characterize them in order to dehumanize them even more, so that slaveholders could further attempt to classify slaves as property. much like their cattle. And, in fact, slaves were often called chattel instead of what they were, which was a human being, just of a different race. And several factors contributed to the practice of slave breeding, one of which was the transformation of the view of slaves from personhood to thinghood, again, as chattel, thus allowing slaves to be bought and sold without challenging the religious beliefs or societal norms of the time. Slaveholders began to interpret biblical passages to justify their economic use of slave labor and the subjugation of slaves. This allowed them to argue that the lower status and subjugation of slaves were natural rights of the white slave owners. Why had white people continuously used the Bible as a means to justify their inhumane evilness towards other peoples, who, white people, for one reason or another, deemed to be of less value than that of a white man? The Crusades, the colonization of America, apartheid in South Africa, and so on. And think about this. Co-author of The American Slave Coast, Ned Sublette, suggests that the reproductive worth of breeding women was essential to the country's expansion, not just for labor, but also as merchandise and collateral, stemming from a shortage of silver, gold, or sound paper tinder. So, some argue that slaves and their descendants were used as human savings accounts, with newborns serving as interest in a market that depended on the continual expansion of slavery. So now, is this a possible origin of the saying that America was built on the backs of black women, literally and figuratively? Historian E. Franklin Frazier mentioned that there were masters who, without any regard for the preferences of their slaves, made it their human chattel as they did their stock. Ex-slave Maggie Stenhouse also spoke about the existence of stockmen. Those were men who were used for the purpose of mating with young women in order to produce children. And in a study by economist Richard Such, he found that on slave holdings with at least one woman, the average ratio of women to men exceeded 2-to-1, with the imbalance being greater in the quote-unquote selling states, where the excess of women over men was 300 per 1,000. However, again, there are differing views on the pervasiveness and economic importance of systematic slave breeding. Think about Robert Fogel and Stanley Ingerman in their 1974 book, Time on the Cross, The Economics of American Negro Slavery. In this book, they argue that there is very meager evidence for the systematic breeding of slaves for sale in the market in the Upper South during the 19th century. They distinguish systematic breeding, which involves interference in normal sexual patterns by masters with an aim to increase fertility or encourage desirable characteristics, from that of pronatalist policies, which involve the generalized encouragement of large families through a combination of rewards, improved living and working conditions for fertile women and their children, and other policy changes by their masters. Bullshit. Forced breeding happened, and it happened for the almighty dollar. And that's all. Now let's look at Virginia, where the expansion of cotton cultivation and the closing of the international slave trade increased the demand for slaves in the Southwest and increased slave prices throughout the South. Slaveholders in the Chesapeake responded to these higher prices by breeding and selling slaves to traders for Southern markets. But there is significant controversy and a lack of consensus on what constitutes slave breeding. And there's no clear consensus on how many slaveholders bred their slaves for the market. This lack of consensus and the absence of comprehensive evidence might make it difficult to substantiate claims about the widespread existence of a slave breeding industry. But it happened. And don't forget that good ancestry records were not kept for slaves. Again, the chattel of their slave owners, as so many African Americans have discovered while trying to trace their ancestry today. As a matter of fact, it is often very difficult for African Americans to trace their ancestry back past the U.S. Census of 1870 because the records of enslaved were often handwritten, poorly maintained, or simply lost over time, according to a Pew Research Center article from April 14, 2022. Now, despite these differing views and the lack of conclusive evidence, it's clear that the topic of slave breeding is a fundamental and deeply troubling aspect of the history of slavery in the United States. Finally, as far as the limited documented evidence of slaveholders breeding slaves for sale, well, could that be partly due to the reprehensible nature of such practices that may have discouraged documentation from the get-go? Or is it really because relatively few slaveholders engaged in the practice? The lack of documentation makes it difficult to substantiate claims about the extent of a slave breeding industry. But remember, slave records were not the best maintained records, and on top of that, slaves were usually referred to by their sex, i.e. male or female, and as the property of their slave owners, not usually by their given name or as the son or daughter of their biological parents. Now, this video does not claim to encompass all perspectives and nuances of this complex and painful aspect of history, but based on the evidence available, it is clear that some form of forced breeding did occur during the period of slavery in the United States. Numerous historical accounts, including slave narratives, testified to the sexual exploitation of enslaved people, including forced marriages, arranged matings, and other forms of sexual abuse. The extent and systematization of these practices, however, remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate. But this video should serve as an eye-opening for many who either did not know or who may have chosen to ignore this black mark on American history for whatever reason or reasons. And in conclusion, while there are accounts and evidence of sexual exploitation and interference in the reproductive lives of slaves, the systematic breeding of slaves for economic purposes is a controversial topic with varying interpretations and a lack of consensus among scholars. The extent of the practice of slave breeding, its economic importance, and its impact on the slaveholding and trading practices of the time remain subjects of ongoing debate. While some evidence suggests that slaveholders may have engaged in breeding practices to increase their labor force or to sell slaves for profit, the systematic nature and economic significance of these practices are still disputed among historians. But none of this debate lessens the impact of this practice on the broader dynamics of the slave trade, the economic structure of the South, and the fact that the lived experiences of enslaved people are complex and multifaceted, underscoring the need for continued exploration and research into this deeply troubling aspect of American history. And in terms of the impact of forced breeding on the lives of enslaved people, it is clear that the sexual exploitation of enslaved women and men was a deeply traumatic aspect of the slavery experience, with profound implications for the physical and psychological well-being of the victims and their families. So ask yourselves this: if this forced breeding happened to you, how would you react? How would it impact your life? And for how long? Comment and let us know. Thanks for watching this social commentary video from Buffy's World. Please like, share, and comment on this video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel for similar content. And we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.